and welcome to this panel discussion on banking, the pandemic dividend with Industry 4.0. Is the window of opportunity still open? I'm Rachel Kelly from Money FM 89.3. Now, COVID-19 has changed the way many of us live, work and play, and faced with the largest economic and healthcare crisis in recent history, companies across all industries were forced to adapt to survive. Some struggled with manpower, others with raw material, and others that tried to balance this while coping with an increase in demand. And help tackle these issues and maintain operations, some turned to Industry 4.0. But can you still do so? Is the window still open? And what kind of returns, or as they say, pandemic dividend, can you get from your investment in Industry 4.0 that may have been made over the past 18 months or more? Well, to find out more, we're joined now by Mr. Paul Marriott, who is the president at SAP Asia Pacific Japan, and Dr. Andreas Hauser, managing director, digital services at TubeSud. Paul and Andreas, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, a pleasure. Thank you.
Great to have you with us. So first of all, let's start off, because for some companies, investing in change or Industry 4.0 technologies may have caused a little bit of strain, looking at pricing, looking at integration of services and technologies. But what are your thoughts? What's the long-term gain here? Paul, perhaps we can start with you.
Yeah, well, look, thanks, Rachel. And clearly the 60% of the world's supply chain is here in Asia, right, with Singapore being a major hub. So it's a topic for every single one of our customers out there. And simply put, those that are doing things to address how they build robustness into the supply chain are the ones that are seeing the bigger opportunity ahead of them as we emerge in this digital future. And those that are not, I think we've seen, far more challenge. So it becomes a business model opportunity for organizations to get that scale in the supply chain. But, it comes obviously with a lot of challenges that we'll talk about today.
That's right. And according to a report by McKinsey that came out earlier this year, it said that overall 94% of those that were surveyed said that Industry 4.0 would really help them to keep things afloat, operations afloat during the crisis. 56% said that these technologies had been critical when it comes to their crisis response. Dr. Hauser, the title of this session is The Window of Opportunity, Is It Still Open? Do you think that's the case? Is there still time for people to tap into Industry 4.0 to leverage some of these gains and pandemic dividends, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think it's not the question whether it's still open. For me, it's slowly opening up. And the pandemic basically accelerated the awareness that we need to change, but also, of course, not only the awareness, we also see some effects in the field, basically in the sector. You mentioned the survey, right? Also, companies are starting managing their factories more remotely. But let's also be clear that shifting in-person meetings to virtual meetings does not necessarily mean Industry 4.0, right? It's basically just a pragmatic way how to deal with that situation. And yes, as this survey has shown, basically the more companies base their operations on technologies, the more independent they are on workforce on site. And that was in the pandemic mainly the reason, right? They couldn't go into the factories. So of course, obviously they are ahead of the curve, but this we still see a very moderate adoption rate of Industry 4.0 still. Also thankfully the pandemic with all its problems and downsides, but at least it really pushed this topic to the top agenda. It's not an option anymore. It's clear either you go that path now sooner than later, or you will have a problem. And generally, this Industry 4.0, what does it actually do? It's not something only if we like technology, we implement certain solutions. It's about improving the agility of factories, technology-based. And that's also, agility is the reason why actually those companies who have reached a certain maturity in this transformation already are much faster in reacting to these changes. So for me, it's really opening, the window is really opening up now. And so I'm looking very much forward to the next few years, basically, because in the past we had to so often convince actually the sector that they should move, but now I think it's quite obvious they have to move, and they're moving.
Why do you think then we've seen a slower adoption? Could this be a result of the pandemic itself, some of the challenges in implementing these technologies at a time when businesses are just trying to stay afloat?
The reasons are manifold. One is definitely that wait and see. So some companies just don't see the urgency to move in that direction. They do good business. They are currently still in a good situation. So why changing then the direction? And transformation is a painful exercise, right? Also this wait and see is definitely one reason for that. Another one, I see that we talk about transformation. Transformation converts something into something else, right? So it's not the same animal we're talking about. We're talking about a significant change over a period of time. And if you and such a transformation requires really strong entrepreneurial leadership and not just management improving, incrementally certain KPIs. It's really a bit a different approach. It requires this leadership, this entrepreneurial leadership. And to be honest, this we see that this is also in many cases not there. Huh?
Mm. So transformation and really evolution, isn't it? Paul, do you have some examples that you might be able to share with us of successful Industry 4.0 implementation stories over the past, I guess, few years or even during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with Dr. Hauser in that the pandemic's just heightened the visibility of the fragility in the supply chain. I think, the demand from a consumer perspective went up significantly. And the ability from a manufacturing perspective was impacted, right? So the actual supply side was impacted. And then you see these interesting events very visible, right? When we saw Ever Given, a container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and the profound impact that had on the supply chains globally just shows that the physical supply chain and then with Industry 4.0 linked to that digitization it's the combination of both. Because now we have to wait 2 years, right, for the Suez Canal to be expanded, right? And that's a long time to wait. But in the pandemic, probably the most, for us, one of the most best examples was actually Moderna. So Moderna is one of our customers. And prior to the pandemic, probably not many people knew who they were. They're actually a very sort of mid-sized company. And their challenge was, how do they take this vaccine that's been approved and get worldwide distribution? So there are great examples of how the supply chain was leveraged to get the scale. And with a vaccination, it has to be done very, very securely. So you can attest that the vaccine that turns up in the vaccination center is absolutely authentic. And doing that at mass scale with huge amounts of political and consumer pressure to get that product around the world. So, we've seen it with those types of organizations. We see, everybody knows the brand Porsche. I mean, they've done in the automotive sector. We see a lot of innovation with Industry 4.0 in terms of lean manufacturing, but also how they can manufacture in a more sustainable way, because the supply chain, unfortunately, is also one of the drivers of the emissions and the high carbon footprint. So the digitization of the supply chain, Rachel, is not only giving you the resilience, but the opportunity to create a more sustainable supply chain, which I think now is obviously a huge topic, much of which was discussed in COP26 last week. So yes, lots of customers that are achieving this for sure.
And we're going to get back to sustainability in just a moment, but let's continue to talk about momentum. In another report out this month that shared that the global Industry 4.0 market's expected to reach $219.8 billion. That's by 2026. What's your thought? What are your thoughts, Paul, on momentum when it comes to Industry 4.0 take-up? Dr. Hauser earlier shared that things have been moving a little bit more a little bit slowly, but do you think you're starting to see momentum really pick up now as well?
Yeah, look, we see, I mean, we have tens of thousands of customers, hundreds of thousands of customers globally. And I see two very distinct patterns in our customers. Customers pre-pandemic that had already established a digital transformation agenda. So they're looking to evolve their business model to remain competitive, provide better products and services to their customers. Those that had that wider digital transformation program, which always is fundamentally addressing the supply chain issues, are no doubt emerging faster and stronger out of the pandemic. And we've seen a doubling, if not a tripling, of organizations that are working with us. So significant demand. In terms of the second type of customer, it's more to what Dr. Hauser said. It's a bit of a wait and see, but maybe take some tactical measures. So there's some often band-aids put in place that allow the business to have a level of continuity, but it's been done sort of very tactically, band-aid by band-aid. And of course, from a technology perspective, that actually can create a lot more complexity in the longer term. We're starting to see those customers now realize they need a more holistic digital transformation program to really drive that at a more strategic level. And we'll definitely see businesses, start to adopt that more and more as well. So two quite different, and frankly, those that didn't do anything, unfortunately, Rachel, some of those organizations are no longer operating, right? That's how, the negative impact of not doing anything can mean that the businesses stop operating altogether.
But it's not easy, is it, to implement some of these technologies? I think before we went live on the panel, Paul, you'd shared that implementing Industry 4.0 can be compared to changing a jet engine mid-flight. Dr. Hauser, what are some of your thoughts or words of advice for businesses that are looking to implement Industry 4.0, but at the same time, navigate some of that turbulence and keep the operations running?
Yeah, you described basically already the dilemma, right? On the one hand, you have your operations, you are busy, very busy with what you're doing, and particularly when what Paul mentioned also, these shifts in the supply chain, these challenges we have just to manage them out of the normal operations is already a challenge, right? That's not an easy task. And then on top of it, you have to basically define a strategy how to transform the company then. That is a double challenge on its own. But I think there's no way around it. Yeah, you have to deal with it. What we observe actually, besides that leadership challenge or issue, what I mentioned, is also that very often there is no real strategy in place, right? We're doing business. Yes, we want to improve profitability. We want to improve revenue, or it's very KPI business driven efficiency. But there's often not really a clear strategy. Where is this going to in the next 3 to 5 years? How should my factory actually look like? And that if this is not there, first of all, you cannot properly plan then this transformation. And I think particularly difficult to explain it to your people, to your workforce. If they don't see where this is going to, they will not support that. And it will only work when the whole team, basically, the whole workforce is also on board. I think there's a lot of leadership strategy, but also governance, which needs to be put into place. And typically, the smaller companies, they can't afford a whole department dealing with the strategy, right? Like the big MNCs, they can do this. They do this, and that's why they're also typically a bit ahead of the curve. But the majority are SMEs, and they clearly, typically, they can't afford having that. But nevertheless, I think there's also simply the fact, and that is coming more and more onto the agenda, also on the SMEs. Houston, we have a problem, right? We need to do something, otherwise we are out. And the big companies, when they look for suppliers, basically, and they see that they are not able to integrate into their ecosystem, and that goes with IT systems, right? With platforms, then they simply then potentially out of the competition, yeah? And that goes faster than expected. I mean, nobody, if you ask me about 2 years ago, before the pandemic, I would have said, no, it takes another 10 years, right, until really the last company gets it. Now it has changed dramatically, right? Now, after 2 years, some are already out and new kids are on the block. So things can change quite fast, actually. And this is ultimately, I think it's a good development, what we see, because as I said, I40 is not just for the sake of having technology. It's really for improving economic growth, also supporting economic growth, but also what we talk about later, I guess, social and environmental sustainability as well.
That's right. Before we get into social, environmental sustainability, you mentioned manpower there. We need to touch on this topic. You mentioned manpower buy-in, and you just have to run a quick search online to see numerous articles, some saying that Industry 4.0 will create job cuts, others saying it will create jobs, others saying it will transform jobs. We spoke earlier about transformation and evolution. Is that what we're seeing in the workforce when it comes to Industry 4.0?
Also generally, I think this is anyway an evolution on our perception of time. We talk about a decade or two, might be started, let's say, more than a decade, obviously, because the term I40 has been coined 10 years ago, and where we are at, we are in an early stage still, right? So this is the long-term development. So it's ultimately for us, it's an incremental thing. But if you look back in 50 years, it will be probably a revolution that was similar to the other industrial revolutions. So there is clearly, if you look into the community, there are voices who say, well, we will have a huge horde of unemployment. Another fraction says we will have even more jobs, job creation through I40. And again, as life normally, reality or the truth lies somewhere in between. As what I think is a current understanding, that there will be a massive displacement of conventional work, right? Because these things, conventional, as long as they are repetitive, can be replaced by automation ultimately. And it will be replaced simply because not only of the costs, it's also a quality a thing as well, right? So if you can automate things with machines, you do it. But also the idea that suddenly we have dark factories where there's no person anymore working in there, I think there's also common understanding this is also not going to happen in the near future. I remember 10 years ago in Germany, that was a huge discussion actually about that. And after a while, one realizes technology doesn't disruptive, yes, but it goes in more as a supporting fact rather than a pure replacement, right? And that goes then into the changes for the workforce, reskilling, upskilling towards not doing the job itself, also the different work steps in a workflow. It's more running then the machine, which is doing the
machine
job.
hand in hand. Isn't that
kind of,
right?
Yes. Also more as a supporting system rather than a complete replacement. And maybe just one more comment on that. Yes, we see probably due to productivity increase, let's say less people in factories. But on the other hand, there's a huge new sector in the service space coming up. And we just mentioned sustainability. There are already new companies coming up offering CO2 footprint calculation, right? How you can reduce your emissions. Also, there's a lot coming around that manufacturing space. So where I'm quite optimistic that we see not this dramatic negative scenario in the future.
So, Paul, just touching on sustainability, since it keeps popping up, we've really got to talk about this. And in a recent report, the Economist Intelligence Unit, they said that Industry 4.0 could well be known as the Green Revolution. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I really love that report, and I love the linkage. I think it's the two things go hand in hand. The difficulty for organizations is that, particularly with what we refer to as scope 3 emissions, these are often, downstream in the supply chain. It's very difficult for a retailer or manufacturer to have direct transparency of that downstream supplier that has obviously its own emissions footprint. So the goal is to have full transparency end to end. So when a consumer buys a product in a store, and in fact, what you'll see is a QR code, they scan it and you'll get the full life cycle of how that product was produced and its full carbon footprint, ideally one that's neutral or zero. So yeah, the supply chain, using technology in the supply chain, and we use what we call business network technology. This is creating networks of networks at a global scale, fully automated right through all the layers of the supply chain, gives tremendous transparency to organizations, not only to get the resilience, but to also measure the footprint and then through circularity, redesign process that today, unfortunately, is take, make, waste based, and drive that to a zero emission, zero waste process. And those supply chain processes where, obviously working on with our software, but I think Industry 4.0 will drive a significant shift in that circularity, which we've got a responsibility to do for, just to make sure we leave the environment in a better place for, for our kids and grandkids, right? We created the problem. We now need to be responsible for fixing it.
And we talk about pandemic dividends and sustainability, just linking the two together, because you've got to look at the relationship that sustainability has with potential partnerships, as you mentioned, supply chains, investors and consumers as well. So why is it so important for businesses to look at sustainability when it comes to Industry 4.0, Paul?
So again, the mindset of leadership of organizations will be, SAP, we're a very purposeful organization. We started having sustainability targets over 10 years ago. We'll be carbon neutral by 2023. So it's taken a 10-year investment to make sure that we get to our own carbon neutrality. And that's a very, very deliberate, very, very purposeful intent. And I think there's a lot of organizations and leaders that I meet that have got that same intent. I would also say, though, that ultimately it will be the consumers that vote, and they'll vote with their wallets in terms of the products and services that they buy. And I think it will become table stakes for organizations to demonstrate the manufacturing, distribution and sale of products that are 100% sustainable. And I just think the consumer will be the one that will drive that. It will be a differentiator in the shorter term for organizations that get their business model to be sustainable. But I think it will become table stakes, and you roll forward 5, 8, 10 years, and it'll be just what all consumers expect. So I think governments need to play their role as well. So the more we can incent organizations through positive regulation, and of course the green funding that can come out of the financial sector to accelerate then large organizations driving that, of course that's a great catalyst, and that has a fantastic downstream effect on all of the suppliers to those big organizations, so that the smaller organizations can then also follow. So I think we'll start to see that. We saw some good announcements coming out of COP26 last week, but in my mind, still not enough. But we're making some progress. We need to go faster.
And progress to move forward is always good. Dr. Hauser, very quickly. So as we look into 2022, as you mentioned, the window of opportunity is opening. What are some things that businesses that perhaps haven't adopted Industry 4.0 yet should look at in the year ahead?
We mentioned this just to continue with the sustainability aspect, right? Because that is an extremely relevant topic for particularly in the next few years to come. The green revolution, I really hope that it is a revolution, that we really change. And we had a chat before this, right, where we said 10 years ago we had already the topic of green cities, sustainable infrastructure and all of that. But now we see really the sentiment is changing, and Paul mentioned it comes from the market, right? That's definitely a very strong driver. And to be honest, I was quite surprised that the sentiment towards sustainability has changed so fast, so quickly. There's hardly any company or leader who is not, let's say, considering this. And of course, it takes a while also, taking the example of SAP, right? It takes a while until you trickle this topic into the organization. But you have to start now. And I4Zero technologies or I4Zero solutions, again, they're not only helping you improving the productivity, but they're really helping you making your product more sustainable and more accepted also from a social standard perspective. So I think this is for the paradigm for the next few years, not only for 2022. I think this is a long-term development, and there's also no acceptance anymore on the consumer side that we just play around with this for the next many decades. We want to see results sooner than later. And with the new technology, as I mentioned at the beginning, you become more agile. You can bring your product faster to the customer, make use of those advantages. If you show a product is more sustainable than your competitor ones, and it's not much more expensive, you will definitely have a bigger market share. I think the equation is still an economic equation, but suddenly we have to consider actually social and environmental requirements as well. And that's why I'm quite positive that we really move things.
That's right. And I think it's been said, if you're not looking at sustainability, you're going to get left behind. Well, Dr. Hauser and Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure we could talk for much longer. There's so much that we can cover here. I'm Rachel Kelly from Money FM 89.3, and I've been speaking with Mr. Paul Marriott, President at SAP Asia Pacific Japan, and Dr. Andreas Hauser, Managing Director Digital Services at TÜV Süd, about banking on the pandemic dividend with Industry 4.0. Is the window of opportunities still open? Wishing you all a fruitful and enjoyable conference ahead.
Thank you.